ACTH, Addison's disease. It's winter 2022. It is week 7. Off we go. ACTH we're talking about, otherwise known as adrenocorticotropic hormone, bunch of AKAs. It's important to know where it comes from. Deeper than it just comes from the anterior pituitary. If you know the name adrenocorticotropic, it comes from corticotroph cells. So they live, here are these little blue dots I photoshopped in today, just so you can have an idea. They live here. Of course, they're much smaller than that, but that's who makes ACTH. ACTH is also a member of the HPA axis. It is the only corticotroph that has an undisputed role in humans. We know exactly what it does. There are some other corticotrophs I won't even talk about. There's one other one that I'll talk about, and its role is kind of known. It's got to do with that blotchy brown tan that people can get with Addison's disease. What does it do? It stimulates the adrenal gland. Deeper. We need a deeper answer. It stimulates the adrenal cortex. Deeper. It stimulates the second two zones, the zona fasciculata and the zona reticularis. Remember the mnemonic for the zones of the adrenal gland? GFR, glomerulosa, fasciculata, and reticularis. So it stimulates mainly zona fasciculata and zona reticularis. And the name of those cells, by the way, are the same, fasciculata cells and reticular cells. It also should be noted that it does stimulate the glomerulosa cells a tiny bit. So it does stimulate them to release a tiny bit of aldosterone. Not clinically important, though, but it does help with a little bit of release of aldosterone, just like the Tasmanian devil mainly causes aldosterone to be released, angiotensin II. But so can ACTH, just a little bit, though. And there's the GFR again. And remember, the adrenal gland sits on top of the kidneys. What's the other AK for it? Super adrenal gland or super renal gland and some other AKs. Pathologists call it the adrenal gland. And you should know this. This is a note card slide. You probably already know this already. Let's not forget the adrenal medulla down here. It secretes the catecholamines like epinephrine, norepinephrine, and a little bit of dopamine as well. Other corticotroph cells, there's a bunch of them that we don't know a lot about, so I'm not going to include them, but there is one that you do need to know. It's another member of this family, and it's called alpha-melanocyte stimulating hormone, and that tells you exactly what it does. It stimulates melanocytes. You remember what melanocytes do? They give you your color, right? So the darker you are, the more active your melanocytes are, or the more density there are of them. So it stimulates melanocytes. It can stimulate melanocytes. We'll look at how that works in a little while. The making of ACTH, so we said it's made by corticotroph cells. They live in the anterior pituitary, but they're not made spontaneously. They need a signal to make them. The corticotroph cells need a kick in the pants to make them. They don't make them unless you kick them. And you kick them with CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, which comes from the hypothalamus. Go deeper than that. Okay, it comes from the paraventricular nuclei of the hypothalamus. Go deeper than that. Okay, it comes from parvocellular neurons, are the ones that really make that. Parvocellular neurons live in the paraventricular nuclei of the hypothalamus. So you never know how deep that board question would go. Maybe it's just say hypothalamus, maybe it's all the way down to parvocellular neurons. So those of you who want to crush boards, which probably most of you do in this room, that's why you're sitting in formation in this room. Everybody else is online or probably getting ready for lunch, finishing lunch maybe. That's how deep you can know it. Let's see. There is another one, though. We talked a little bit about ADH-p, those same corticotroph cells also secrete a form of ADH that doesn't have anything to do with the kidney. I call it ADH-p because it came from parvocellular neurons. They probably won't call it that. That's my labeling to help you with it. But this ADH that comes from parvocellular neurons has nothing to do with water retention. Question?
So how do they differentiate that on the boards if they're both just called ADH? Would they say like the ADH produced by the parvo?
They would have to say that.
Okay.
And that would be a really deep question, but maybe not so deep because this is really involved in the stress-related response of cortisol. It's this ADH-p. And I should Google that. Maybe others call it that. I just kind of, so maybe I'll do that. But they should do that. But we'll see here in a second how that works. Question?
So does ADH-p work with the cortisol, or does it directly go to the, help create more ACTH?
It binds to corticotroph cells just like CRH does. It's exactly, and it uses CRH's receptors too. So very strange, and we'll see more about that here in a minute. More specifically, the making of CRH. How does it get there? Remember, CRH is made by these little neurons right here, and their axons, which transport the CRH, they don't go all the way down to the anterior pituitary. Like the posterior pituitary has those, the magnocellular neurons have those long axons. They make the ADH up here and it's transported all the way down. It's not the way it works here. There's a middleman here. So the CRH is made and it's dumped into this hypothesial portal system, and it's taken really quickly, but it's taken by this secondary, this middleman down to the anterior pituitary, where it goes off and the microcirculation diffuses into these cells, binds to these cells. Specifically, it binds to CRH1 receptors. That's really a deep one. Corticotropin releasing hormone receptor 1 is who it binds to. I don't think the boards are going to go that deep, but you never know. And that's how it has its effects. It stimulates the corticotroph cells to produce their product. And I think I already said that the real product isn't ACTH. It's something called POMC that is really made. It's almost an ACTH molecule with an extra little tail on it. So you got to cut the tail off it to make it ACTH. That's called POMC, or pro-opiomelanocortin. So that's another one. I don't know how deep the board's going to get, but you'll be ready for the deepest possible board question by knowing that. There's an enzyme called PC1, prohormone convertase 1, that is needed to cut the tail off of pro-opiomelanocortin. Once you chop the tail off it, it becomes our friend, adrenocorticotropic hormone. PC1 is actually made by corticotroph cells as well. There is a PC2 as well, and that lives in the dermis of the skin. It's made by fibroblasts in the dermis. And that doesn't really do much of anything. It just kind of hangs out until very high levels of ACTH come around. And if that situation ever occurs, the ACTH will, if so much is released, it can start to get into the skin, into the dermis. And if it gets into the dermis and PC2 grabs it, it cleaves it, it chops its tail off and makes it into a new molecule. And that's called Alpha-MSH, melanostimulating hormone. And MSH can bind to melanocytes. And melanocytes are doing their job as normal. They're always injecting the keratinocytes. But if this binds to them, they go crazy and they just start over-injecting melanin like crazy. And so those affected by an over-secretion of ACTH, like in Addison's disease, they get a weird blotchy tan. It's not like a smooth, beautiful tan, like go to the beach tan. It's like this kind of a tan. So that's someone with Addison's disease who has very high levels of ACTH. And PC2 is in the skin, it's having a field day. It's got a purpose in life now. And this can be completely corrected once you figure out what's wrong with a patient and you stop the overproduction of ACTH. This will all go away. She'll go back to normal. Okay, I think we got that. Let's see, I kind of said this already. CRH is corticotropin releasing hormone. Again, its main job is to stimulate corticotroph cells. We said that already, to make POMC or ACTH. It's released by parvocellular neurons, we said. Parvocellular neurons live in the paraventricular nuclei, which live in the hypothalamus. There's the 3 layers of deepness we talked about already. We said that neurons are very short. Basically said all this stuff already. Said CRH is dumped into the medium eminence region, jumps into the hypophyseal portal vessels, and it's taken down to the anterior pituitary, binds to CRH1. Kind of said all that already. Question?
Just wondering about the ADH that's made in the supraoptic nucleus. That's only ever the regular ADH, and then the ADH-p is only ever made in the parvocellular.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. They never jump ship. This regular ADH never gets to the anterior pituitary. It's always on this side, in the posterior pituitary. ADH-p always comes on this side. And interesting to see if experiments, if you injected that in to the kidney, what would happen. I haven't read any experiment like that. I wonder if it would stimulate free water, but I haven't gone that deep into it. But maybe it would a little bit. But they're in separate systems, so they don't mix. Good question. All right, here's just a summary of everything we said. All right, so ADH-p, as we said already, it comes from parvocellular neurons as well. A little bit is made. It's made right along with the CRH, and they both go down to the anterior pituitary. They both bind. They both stimulate the release of POMC, ACTH. Normally, the ADH-p isn't great at binding to those receptors on corticotroph cells, so it's really not clinically significant. If you have a mutated gene for it, it's no big deal. But the problem comes in with stress. Stress really kicks up the production of ADH-p, and it does something to the receptor on corticotroph cells to make it more bindable. So the affinity is much greater in someone under stress, and we don't understand the mechanism of that. That probably won't even be on board. That's so new information, but it's interesting how that works. Just a side note, I never make it to the thyroid story, which is still important. But those same parvocellular neurons also make TRH, thyrotropin stimulating hormone, which you probably will remember. That goes down to the anterior pituitary, and that binds to a different type of cell called thyrotropes. Thyrotropes aren't as numerous as corticotrophs. There's way more corticotrophs than these thyrotropes. Thyrotropes then make thyroid-stimulating hormone, which goes down to the thyroid and binds to those colloid cells. And in a fairly complicated mechanism with iodine, it creates the thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. So parvocellular neurons are actually really, really important. You don't want to have a mutation in those things because they're very important. That's all the farther we'll go in that, down that pathway for now. This is just the big picture of everything we've said. So there's parvocellular neurons. They make CRH, a little bit of ADH-p. They go down, they bind to the corticotroph cells. Corticotroph cells release POMC. PC1 actually double cuts the tail. If you really want to get into the weeds, it double cuts the tail to make ACTH. The ACTH can get into the skin and be cleaved by PC2 into Alpha-MSH, which stimulates melanocytes, which causes your skin to get kind of a blotchy tan type appearance. So that's the big overall picture. And of course, ACTH, the main function is to go over, hit the adrenal gland and cause mainly the release of cortisol and the adrenal steroid DHEA or DHES. or androstenedione, because those are all kind of end products. We'll look at that here in a second. Some fun facts: there are other CRH-containing neurons that live in the that live throughout the CNS, and they don't have any idea what they do. But the ones in the hypothalamus aren't the only ones. They are also found in the placenta, and they have a critical role in pregnancy, which is also a little mysterious. So I'm not going to ask you those. Only one measly star. I'm not going to ask you that, but there are some other. There's more to the story. How about the regulation of CRH? That's pretty easy. That's that famous double negative feedback system. CRH can be shut down by cortisol itself. And what's the ultimate end product of CRH? It's not well, it's kind of ACTH, but the ultimate end product, what does ACTH do? Makes cortisol, right? And DHEA too, but that's not like survivable important. Cortisol, you need cortisol to live. So cortisol can turn around and bind to receptors on parvocellular neurons and shut off the production of CRH. As we'll see, getting ahead of my slides though. Double negative feedback, kind of everything I just said. The increase, if cortisol increases too high, it can bind to glucocorticoid receptors on the parvocellular neurons and shut down the production of CRH and ADH-p as well, shuts them off. This is the main regulator of ACTH, parvocellular neurons binding to cortisol. There's a backup system though. The cortisol can also bind to the corticotroph cells. And so if something's broken with the receptor for cortisol and CRH is cranked out like crazy, you can still turn off the production of ACTH at the corticotroph cell level itself. Okay, so it binds and shuts down the production of POMC and ACTH. And here's, you've probably seen this before, but here's charts sometimes are best. Here's a patient who has produced plenty of cortisol. Maybe they had a stress event and they had to squirt out a little more cortisol to get a little more glucose into the bloodstream. And the cortisol is high enough now where it binds to parvocellular neurons and shuts off CRH here, and it also binds to corticotroph cells here and shuts them down. And so we get a decreased production of CRH and a decreased production, kind of a double decreased production of POMC ACTH by this mechanism. So the old double So it doesn't matter if you have a mutation with the receptor for cortisol in corticotroph cells, don't worry about it because we can shut it off up here, and vice versa. If there's a mutation for the cortisol's receptor in parvocellular neurons, don't worry about it, we can shut it off here. So it's very important not to let ACTH and cortisol run wild. Stress, as we said, it is well known that stress responses are, and everybody gets a little stressed, but I mean like a death of a loved one. You just got kicked out of chiropractic college and you're in 8th quarter. I mean, major stress can definitely increase the levels of cortisol in the body. And how does that work? Because you have an increased level of ACTH. It has no direct effect on the adrenal gland that we know of. You get an overproduction of CRH and ADH-p that makes this overstimulate corticotroph cells and then overproduce ACTH or POMC ACTH. Which in turn drives the production of cortisol, and you have way too much cortisol, and we'll look at that the next lecture of what that can do. Also, the stress also causes the corticotroph cells to grow more receptors that have higher affinity for ADH-p, as I said already. So normally ADH-p doesn't have that great of effect, but in stress can promote, kind of supercharge ADH-p, and it has a much more powerful effect, and it can drive the release of much more ACTH. All right, so overproduction of CRH and ACTH, so what? Does that have any other sequelae? Yeah, the adrenal cortex. I mean, if if you're cranking out cortisol and ADH like crazy, those cells are like they just went on steroids and went into the weight room, are lifting every day. They're working and working and working. They can get big really fast. And the adrenal cortex can become visibly bigger or hypertrophic within 2 weeks of having some breakdown in the machinery that shuts off cortisol. Or even if it's stress, severe stress can do it. So it just takes 2 weeks. The adrenal gland can swell up from the bombardment of ACTH. The cortisol, or the cortex, the adrenal cortex also becomes more sensitive to ACTH as this goes around. If there's a lot of ACTH floating around and the adrenal cortex is binding it, it gets better and better at binding it, and pretty soon it binds it too easily, and that can drive the overproduction of the glucocorticoids as well.
Does this go back down, like once you get hypertrophy?
Yes,
Yeah.
it can
So
go
it
back
just
down.
reduce your stress levels?
Yep, it's not permanent. Assuming it hasn't been going on for years and years, then it's probably not going to go back down. But if it's an acute situation, it can definitely go back down. Good question again. Okay. So, of course, we'll talk about Cushing's syndrome, the overproduction of cortisol, probably in 2 lectures from now. So what about, we keep talking about cortisol, what about the adrenal androgens? What about the zona reticularis? Because that has receptors for ADH as well. Why don't we ever talk about that? It is being driven just as hard as the zona fasciculata is. No one ever talks about it because it's not life-threatening to have the adrenal steroids be overcreased. That's not going to kill you. You're not going to pass out. You're not going to go to the emergency room. But there is some sequelae from the overproduction of these adrenal androgens, especially in females. Because where do females get their testosterone from? From right here. The ovary produces about 20% or so. But this is where most of them get their testosterone. So if you have an overproduction of ACTH, you're going to have an overproduction of testosterone in women, and they're going to start taking on man characteristics if this something isn't done in the long term. It's going to take quite a long time for it to happen, but it will happen. The adrenal androgens, not to be confused, here's a note card. What's the difference between adrenal androgens and the adrenal steroids? Well, they're all made from cholesterol, so everything, aldosterone, cortisol, and DHEA, they're all steroids. So those are the adrenal steroids. Everything that squirts out of the adrenal gland is the adrenal steroids. Adrenal androgens only come from the zona fasciculata. Those are the androgens, are like testosterone and estrogen. Those are androgens. They come from the zona reticularis, GFR, zona reticularis, makes them. Let's see, who are they? DHEA is the main one. Some authors don't even say DHEA, they say androstenedione. So these are all kind of interchangeable, and they're all kind of the in phases. Where is that picture? Let's look at it quickly. So here's this, we haven't seen this for a while, but here's cholesterol. So cholesterol it goes in and out and back out and in, that crazy pathway. But it makes, cholesterol ultimately makes aldosterone, cortisol, and one of these adrenal androgens. And the pathway, of course, 21-hydroxylase, we're going to talk about a lot. But the pathway can go equally all directions. But here, when it gets over here, the first end molecule that's made from cholesterol through pregnenolone is DHEA. And that can switch forms back and forth every minute with DHEAS. Just add a sulfate group on it. But it can also maybe not be stable in that form. It may slip into androstenedione. So some authors say this is the end phase of the adrenal steroids, androstenedione. And that can go either into the estrogens or it can go into the testosterone. So this is kind of the pathway. That's why some authors use this. And it can't go back to DHEA either. So that's another reason. The board books tend not to use this, though. They use DHEA. But you should definitely know that if you see androstenedione, that's the end product. That's the ultimate major molecule, major adrenal steroid is androstenedione. And then that can be used to either make testosterone or the estrogens, which of course are estrone, estradiol, and estrol. There's 3 estrogens. When you say estrogen, it can be any one of these forms. So that's kind of the pathway that it goes. Did Dr. Dumanier go over that stuff much? A little bit.
So did Dr. Fanatical.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Good.
He went over like 21 hydroxylase and a lot of that pathway.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, he's going way deeper than the old teacher
he
was,
is.
which is good, I think, for
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, it definitely makes a lot of this easier to absorb.
Yeah, like I said, your grades are way higher than before, so something has happened.
And we're the first class with them.
I think-
for both GI and, did they have them for GI and?
Not
Endo?
GI, no.
I think we're the first one.
Yeah, you're the first full class with him, but yeah, I'll have to tell him that. Probably make him happy if I say that. Yep. So I got ahead of my slides again. Oh, so yeah. So we just talked about that. The fun facts were on this slide. So DHEA. These are the main estrogens or androgens in women. They can be converted to estrogens or testosterone. We just showed you that pathway. Again, females don't make testosterone. They don't have testes, of course, biological females. So that's where their testosterone comes from, 80% of it. They can get a little bit from the ovary, about 20%, until menopause hits. Then they lose that 20%. That's why women get a little more delicate after menopause. They lose that little extra testosterone, which testosterone increases protein synthesis, so makes the bones thicker, makes recovery from workouts better, and also causes cancer, increases the chance of cancer. Cancer cells love testosterone. That's like Scooby snacks for them. Is that still around, Scooby-Doo? I thought, oh, they may not know where that is, Scooby snacks. Yeah, it also plays a role in fetal development as well. And then we got cheating, too. So androstenedione can be injected, or it has been injected in the past. Now they've gotten wise to this, but back in the 80s and 90s, they weren't wise to this. This wasn't illegal back then. Now it's banned, but androstenedione could be injected, especially in males. It's readily converted into testosterone, huge amounts of testosterone, and it cleans out of the system fairly quickly once you stop the injection. So it was one way to kind of cheat the system. And of course, testosterone, as I said, it increases protein synthesis. It makes the synapse fire faster. Not only weightlifters use it, but at running athletes. It makes you more steady for shooting athletes and archery. Everybody uses this stuff, or they used to use this stuff until they're getting pretty good at catching it now. But it really makes a huge difference. It doesn't magically make you stronger. It allows you to work out much harder and recover much faster. You do a heavy squat on Wednesday without this stuff, you won't be ready to go until probably next Wednesday. If you're on steroids, you're ready to go by Friday. So it just really speeds up the workout schedule. If you don't do anything, you're not going to get strong, though. It doesn't magically make you strong. It just allows you to train way harder. And then for guys, there are some unwanted side effects of too much testosterone, and that's these things. So that's gynecomastia, or the dreaded, as it was known in our circle. I don't know if they still say that, but that's what they called them. And when you see those in a bodybuilder, they've went too crazy with testosterone. And that increases the estrogen to testosterone ratio when they come off. It's not while they're on it, it's when they come off, their estrogen levels go way high because their own mechanism to make testosterone is gone. So they almost become female for a while until their testes turn back on. And in the meantime, they can grow little breasts. And then we said, back to DHEA, in women, if it's not taken care of, they can develop male-like characteristics, and that, of course, has a name. That's called virilization. Make sure you know that name. virilization or virilizing, and that's the turning of females into males. And this is a biological female who has Cushing's syndrome, and she's got like a full beard going on, and clitoris might have elongated by this point, I would assume. We did see it in this paper. But yeah, she starts turning, her voice gets deep, she gets hairy whiskers, starts to look like a man. And we don't need to look at that anymore, I need to move that. Again, that 21-hydroxylase sounds like you guys are pretty good at it. So if you have a deficiency of 21-hydroxylase, like a mutation, or we're going to look at an autoimmune attack, there's an autoimmune attack specifically against 21-hydroxylase. If you knock this out of action, you're in trouble, right? Because you need 21-hydroxylase to make cortisol and aldosterone. I mean, you could die from this. So 21-hydroxylase. But let's pretend you're not worried about dying. What's the other consequence of losing 21-hydroxylase? What will happen to this pathway if pregnenolone and progesterone, if it can't get utilized or burned up in that pathway, where does it go? It goes that way, right? It can't go this way, it's got to go somewhere. It goes this way and becomes DHEA, and is also eventually transformed into testosterone and estrogen. And so in females who have 21-hydroxylase deficiency, they also get virilization because the cycle drives, it's got to go somewhere, so that's the way it goes. No 21-hydroxylase. I think I just said all this stuff. Yep, I did. So deficiency means the enzyme isn't working. All right. What else does DHEA do besides masculize somebody or virilize somebody? It causes acne because of the increased protein synthesis. The sebaceous glands overproduce sebum, which clogs up the pores in your skin. Bacteria feed on sebum, so you get acne. Causes pubic hair growth, axillary hair growth, and yeah. If you're a little kid, anarchy starts when the zona reticularis matures and starts cranking out more androgens. Normally, zona reticularis isn't very active till about 11 years old or so. It starts waking up, and now the hormones start raging in both sexes. Yep, I don't know if that was Photoshop, Julia Roberts, but maybe she doesn't like to shave her armpits. I don't know. I thought that was interesting, but people with adrenal androgen problems, over secretion, they do get pubic hair and body odor and the whole 9 yards. What about the absence of ACTH? Well, then cortisol is going to be in the toilet, right? You can't. Can you make cortisol without ACTH? No, you can't. Can you make DHEA and estrogen? No, you can't. So now we can go to the opposite side. So ACTH absence causes a problem as well. What will happen? Can we tell with an MRI what if you have an absence of ACTH? You can. Within that 2-week frame, if you don't use it, you lose it. The cortex of the adrenal gland will start to atrophy. Just the opposite, and we can see that on MRI and on imaging. Note that if ACTH is not secreted for whatever reason, aldosterone is not going to be involved this time, because aldosterone is secreted in response to angiotensin II mainly. A little tiny bit of the drop will not be clinically significant. You won't have full power release of aldosterone, but probably 95%, I would say, of it. Secondary adrenal insufficiency, we'll get to that. All right, so now that brings us to adrenal insufficiency. And that JFK was always rumored to have Addison's disease because he always was tan, and they didn't have tanning booths back in then, and he wasn't always at the beach. He was working in the White House, so why was he always so tan? We don't know the answer. The rumor is that he had Addison's disease, but clinicians look at this and say, this is not Addison's disease because it's too perfect. It's not blotchy. People with Addison's disease usually have a blotchy I mean, I guess maybe he's got some makeup on or something. Maybe it's a little blotchy in here if you look close at it. So I don't know. That's a mystery. Did he have Addison's disease or not? So let's get into the adrenal insufficiency. Hypoadrenalism. Watch out for that word. Remember, adrenalism. What does that mean, adrenalism? Is that hypoadrenalism or hyper? That's hyper. It's an AKA for hyperadrenalism. So watch out for that. This one they'll never call adrenalism. They always call it hypoadrenalism, or adrenal insufficiency, or Addison's disease, depending on the cause. But this was the birth of endocrinology, discovered by Addison. Had a patient with decreased cortisol levels, and endocrinology was born. What is it? It's a failure of all or part of the adrenal cortex to produce its hormones. Mainly are collectively called the adrenal steroids. And it depends what type it is. And we'll look at the types here in a second. And it is life-threatening. We'll look at this more next time, how it can put you in the hospital, could kill you. But it is life-threatening because glucocorticoids, cortisol, and the mineralocorticoids are essential for life if it affects aldosterone. So no adrenal steroids means hypovolemia, means hyperkalemia, means metabolic acidosis, means hypoglycemia. You can go into hypoglycemic shock. We'll look at that mechanism because that one's a little not so intuitive. But yeah, you lose your adrenal gland, you can be dead in between 3 and 14 days. You can't live much past that. There's two flavors. There's primary and secondary adrenal insufficiency, just like adrenalism. There's a primary and secondary. Let's look at primary first. So this is Addison's disease. Addison's disease is AKA primary adrenal insufficiency or primary hypoadrenalism. They're all AKAs. Its prevalence is just like Marfan syndrome, 0.01. And this is a problem with the adrenal cortex. I always remember Addison's disease, adrenal cortex problem. That's messed up. The pituitary gland is fine, the hypothalamus is fine, but the adrenal gland is messed up. What messes it up? There's really two things that can mess up the adrenal gland to give you Addison's disease. It's either a bug like tuberculosis has gotten into the adrenal gland. For whatever reason, the TB bug loves the adrenal gland, or it's an autoimmune attack against, guess who? 21-hydroxylase. And so it's an autoimmune attack, less deep question or answer. It's an attack against the adrenal cortex itself. So let's look at these two things here. Let's see, disease, some or all of adrenal steroids are not released. It depends on what the cause is. We'll look at that in a second. But again, it's either caused by an autoimmune attack or an infection. It could be caused by cancer, really rare cancers and blood clots as well, could be added in there. But for the big two are autoimmune attack, infection. We'll look at all the causes right now. The most common, 85% of the time, in reasonably developed nations, it's an autoimmune attack against 21-hydroxylase. Very specific attack. And that causes inflammation and knocks out 21-hydroxylase, and therefore you can't, very deadly, you can't make aldosterone and you can't make cortisol. This is called autoimmune adrenal insufficiency oftentimes. But I have a feeling on the boards they're not going to say autoimmune adrenal insufficiency because that gives you the answer. They'll probably say primary adrenal insufficiency and make you remember that primary, that's autoimmune, or that's one possibility is autoimmune, because there's some other ones too, infection. Again, favorite target, 21-hydroxylase gene. Also has another strong AKA, CYP 21. Cover your paycheck until you're 21 years old. That's how I remember it. Or there's some other words you could use in there. CYP 21. There are other AKAs like P450, 21A2. They're not going to ask you that in the boards. It's either going to be 21 hydroxylase is classic or maybe CYP21. I would bet 21 hydroxylase. Let's see. So note, if 21 hydroxylase is the target, how are the adrenal androgen levels going to be in this patient? Are they going to be affected? No.
It says they're spared.
Yeah, it says they're spared. Read the slides and you will be, they're spared. But let's see how that works. And again, 21 hydroxylase is needed to convert progesterone basically all the way down the train to aldosterone, or progesterone turn into cortisol. So you can't run these two pathways. You can't make aldosterone, but you can make this pathway. So you can make DHEA or DHES or androstenedione or testosterone, or you can go any way down this pathway. It's not going to be affected. So the blood work on these patients will show the signs of hypoaldosteronism and hypocortisolism. But in fact, these will be even high, right? If you can't go this way, these levels will be higher than normal eventually. All right, see how that works. What about testing? How do you know if the patient has it? We really don't have a great test other than taking a biopsy. But there is an antibody test for Addison's disease. It's terrible in humans, 50% accurate. But in kids, it's 100% accurate. It's really good in kids. So you can, if you find this antibody in kids, then they have Addison's disease. So it's a little more difficult in adults to figure out. There's association. Addison's is autoimmune attack. So they're going to have other autoimmune disease. In fact, 50% of people with Addison's disease have another autoimmune disease like type 1 diabetes, hypothyroidism, vitiligo, rheumatoid arthritis, pernicious anemia, atrophic gastritis. These are all autoimmune diseases, especially the type 1 diabetes here. So 50% is a big number. Now, what about another type of Addison's disease? So this is an autoimmune Addison's. This is non-autoimmune Addison's disease. So this time, if it's not autoimmune, that means it's an infection or it's cancer. And so the entire adrenal gland will be taken out of action. So if we go back to this chart, if the entire adrenal gland is gone, you can't run any of these pathways. So you won't have aldosterone, cortisol, or any of this pathway starting at DHEA. So that's one way you can tell the difference between autoimmune and non-autoimmune Addison's disease is just by running those simple tests and see if they have DHEA or androstenedione levels. A simple way to do it. Test the androstenedione levels. If they don't have androstenedione levels, then you know they got a cancer or they got an inflammation or an infection, which causes an inflammation. All right, so all steroids will be out. Okay, infection again. The favorite infection is tuberculosis, especially worldwide. This is the most common cause of Addison's disease worldwide. In the modern world, the developed world, it's the autoimmune attack on 21 hydroxylase. But in the whole world, it's tuberculosis takes the lead there. There's some other bugs that occasionally do it. The AIDS virus can do it. Histoplasmosis, cytomegalovirus virus can do it. So these are more rare causes, but tuberculosis, you better know that one for sure. Then we have the non-infectious types of Addison's disease. So we got three types of Addison's disease. We got autoimmune Addison's, non-autoimmune Addison's, which is infection, and now non-infectious Addison's disease. And that's some of the bad ones. Cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer. It doesn't happen super often, but it can. Cancer cells can invade the adrenal cortex and take hold and ravage the entire adrenal cortex, destroying it and causing an inflammation, knocking everything out. Maybe these are vascular types of Addison's disease where you get something blocking the blood flow to the adrenal cortex and it dies. And if it dies, it's not going to secrete anything. So if you got an aneurysm in the adrenal adrenal artery and it pops, you're not going to get blood to the adrenal gland. It's going to die, and you're going to have a loss of all hormones. If you get an embolism and it gets stuck in the adrenal vein, and it grows, it beaver dams and grows and crutches the adrenal artery, that's eventually going to kill off the adrenal gland as well. So 3 types of Addison's disease. In primary adrenal insufficiency, what are the blood work findings would you find? Now they would have to tell you a little bit, because you'd have to know the difference. Is it autoimmune Addison's or is it non-autoimmune Addison's? So you'd have to know a little bit about the question. If they don't tell you, if they don't get specific, if they just say Addison's disease, assume it's autoimmune Addison's. Just assume that, because we're in the Western world. But I think they're going to tell you it's either autoimmune or non-autoimmune Addison's disease. So the blood work depends on what is knocked out and what's not. But if it's primary, where it's an autoimmune attack and you can't make cortisol and aldosterone, well, those levels will be very low. And then what's all the associations with low aldosterone? If you don't have aldosterone, you can't reabsorb salt or water, so you're going to have watery blood, so hyponatremic blood you'll have. You'll have low blood pressure. Cortisol also decreases blood pressure. It also decreases blood glucose levels. We'll get to that more later. And then because of the low blood pressure, you're going to have high levels of renin, or hyperreninemia. That's a new word I just added a couple hours ago. I like that word. Hyperreninemia. That's too much renin floating around. So that's caused by the hypotension, the R2A system turned on, and trying to combat that. Here's another one I just added today. Aren't you guys lucky? I like this. Salt wasting crisis. So with a 21-hydroxylase deficiency, you might slip into something called a sodium wasting crisis, and that in fact is the most common type of someone who's born a congenital 21-hydroxylase destruction. If you don't have 21-hydroxylase, you can't make aldosterone. Without aldosterone, and you can't make cortisol either, but this is, not having aldosterone is a huge problem. You're going to have hyponatremia because you can't reabsorb salt. You'll have hyperkalemia because you can't kick out potassium. You'll have hypotension because you can't reabsorb salt and water. And then you'll have that hyperreninemia. The R2A system will be trying to fight the hypotension. That's it's called a salt wasting crisis. Blood findings in primary autoimmune related adrenal insufficiency. So what will the ADH levels look like, or the DHEA levels look like? Well, if it's autoimmune attack, that side is spared, because we can make plenty of, in fact, we'll make too much ADH if it's an attack against 21-hydroxylase. So in primary autoimmune related adrenal insufficiency, they're going to have normal levels or elevated levels of the adrenal steroids or the adrenal androgens, and then they'll have increased ACTH. Because why would they have increased ACTH? There's no negative feedback, right? There's nothing very good. There's nothing to shut off either of these. So these levels are going to be off the chart. And this is what drives that blotchy bronze tan right here, because that's going to get into the skin. And PC2 is going to convert that into alpha-melanocyte stimulating hormone. It's going to stimulate the melanocytes to go wild and overproduce melanin. Sounds like you guys got it down. There's that thing again. I don't think we need that. Classic symptoms of Addison's disease are sometimes mysterious. So here's just a list of patients that have come into the emergency room before they figured out what was the matter with them. They lose weight for some reason. We don't exactly know what. They've been fighting this a while. They're often nauseated and they can be vomiting. Don't know the mechanism of that. But 100% of them have, they don't want to eat. They've lost their appetite. They've lost weight 100%. They're fatigued. That pigmentation is pretty darn common. 94% of them have hyperpigmentation. So you know it's definitely one of the primary adrenal insufficiency diseases. They have that 92% have nausea, vomiting, which leads back to these first two. Again, the mechanisms are unknown. And then 90% have hypotension. So it can be quite challenging to diagnose this. Oh, the most important thing of the day. We have, I don't think I showed you this one. This is a very young red-shouldered hawk taken right at sunset last week. The sun was beating right on it, but if you look closely, there's a little red spot right there.
Not now.
This is not an owl, online people. Not an owl. This is a hawk, a red-shouldered hawk. I will see you. I guess I better go write the test then. And I will see you tomorrow afternoon at, I believe, 1 o'clock, is it? At 1 o'clock for the test. And then I will do the lecture, put that online.
Thanks, Doc.
All right, you guys. See you later. Let me check in online to see if there's any questions. Let me save